The salt wind carries something ancient across this harbor. Can you feel it? The air itself seems heavier here, as if it still remembers the hands that carved these stones, the voices that echoed through these narrow streets, the ships that departed from this very shore carrying cargo that would reshape the known world. We stand in the heart of Phoenicia, along a narrow strip of coastline where the mountains of Lebanon plunge dramatically toward the Mediterranean Sea. Behind us, the great cedars still cling to the hillsides. Before us, the ruins of a harbor that once connected continents. And beneath our feet, layers upon layers of history stretching back 5,000 years. This is a civilization that never commanded vast armies. It never carved an empire from conquered lands. And yet, the Phoenicians achieved something far more enduring than any military conquest. They gave humanity the alphabet. Those 22 letters, first scratched into stone at Byblos around 1050 before Christ, became the foundation of Greek, Latin, Arabic, and virtually every writing system the Western world has ever known. They transformed communication itself, and in doing so, they changed the course of human civilization forever. Over the course of this series, we will journey from the very beginning of this remarkable people, from the earliest fishing settlements that dotted this coast around 3000 before Christ, through their golden age under King Hiram I of Tyre, across the open ocean with sailors who navigated by starlight alone, and all the way to the founding of mighty Carthage by the legendary Queen Elissa. We will witness the staggering wealth generated by Tyrian purple, a dye so precious that a single pound was worth more than its weight in silver. We will stand inside the workshops where artisans blew molten glass into forms that dazzled the courts of pharaohs and kings. We will watch as Assyrian armies demand tribute, as Nebuchadnezzar blockades Tyre for 13 brutal years, and as Alexander the Great builds his infamous causeway to breach the island fortress once and for all. And we will follow the Phoenician spirit westward to Carthage, where Hannibal Barca will challenge Rome itself across the frozen peaks of the Alps. This is not just a history lesson. This is a complete journey through time, from origins to legacy, from the first cedar log floated to Egypt to the final fading of the Punic tongue under Roman rule. We will explore how ordinary people lived along these quays, what they believed, how they worshipped gods named Melkart and Astarte, and what drove them to sail beyond the Pillars of Hercules into the unknown Atlantic. What you are about to discover shaped the world we inhabit today. Every letter you read, every trade route that crosses an ocean, every principle of international commerce traces a thread back to these purple-stained harbors. The Phoenicians invented globalization thousands of years before the word existed. They proved that ideas travel farther than armies, and that a single alphabet can outlast 1,000 empires. By the end of this series, you will understand not just what happened along this ancient coast, but how an entire civilization rose from modest origins, flourished through ingenuity rather than force, and left a legacy so deeply woven into our world that we carry it with us every time we write a single word. If you enjoy these complete journeys through ancient civilizations, please subscribe so you do not miss our next exploration. Each week we bring you the full story of a lost world, told with the depth and wonder it deserves. Now, let us begin our journey at the very dawn of this coast, when the first Canaanite settlers looked out across the shimmering Mediterranean and imagined a future written on the waves. The sea is still. A pale morning light touches the eastern Mediterranean, catching the surface in a sheet of hammered bronze. The Lebanon mountains rise sharply from the water, their western slopes dense with forest, cedar, juniper, pine, a dark green wall climbing towards snow-dusted peaks. Between these mountains and the sea, a narrow ribbon of coastal plain stretches barely 20 kilometers at its widest. In places, the rock face drops directly into the surf, leaving no shore at all. This slender margin of habitable land, pressed between stone and salt water, becomes the cradle of one of history's most consequential civilizations. Around 3,000 years before the Common Era, small communities of Canaanite-speaking peoples cluster along this coast. They are fishermen and farmers, gatherers of shellfish, tenders of olive groves on terraced hillsides. Their settlements are modest, clusters of mud brick and stone dwellings arranged without grand planning, rooted in the practical rhythms of subsistence. But one site already distinguishes itself. At a natural promontory jutting into the sea, where a freshwater spring meets the shoreline, the settlement known to its inhabitants as Gubal begins to grow. The Greeks will later call it Byblos. It is among the oldest continuously inhabited cities on Earth. The geography here is generous in specific ways. The promontory offers natural harbor protection from winter storms. The spring provides reliable fresh water. The coastal shelf drops steeply into deep water, allowing larger vessels to approach close to shore. And behind the settlement, ascending the mountain slopes in seemingly endless ranks, stand the cedars of Lebanon, trees of extraordinary height and girth, their aromatic wood resistant to rot, straight-grained and ideal for construction. These trees are the settlement's first great currency. Egypt, the colossal civilization flourishing along the Nile to the south, possesses virtually no suitable timber. The desert kingdom requires wood for temple doors, palace beams, coffins, and above all, ships. Under Pharaoh Sneferu, who reigns around 2,600 years before the Common Era, Egyptian expeditions arrive at the Levantine coast seeking cedar in large quantities. The Palermo stone, an ancient Egyptian royal chronicle, records the arrival of 40 ships laden with cedar logs, a transaction of enormous scale for the period. Byblos becomes the primary point of exchange. The harbor at Gubal transforms. Simple fishing beaches give way to timber-loading quays. Logs are dragged down mountain paths by teams of laborers, floated in coastal shallows, and lashed together for the voyage south. In return, Egyptian goods flow into the settlement: gold, papyrus, linen, alabaster vessels, faience beads. The material culture of early Byblos begins to reflect this relationship. Pottery workshops produce vessels that blend local Canaanite forms with Egyptian decorative motifs. Storage facilities expand along the waterfront. This is not yet a city of grand temples or monumental architecture. The dwellings remain relatively simple, their walls of rough limestone and packed earth, their roofs of timber and reed. But the foundations of something larger are being laid, not in stone alone, but in the patterns of exchange, the accumulation of maritime knowledge, the slow recognition that the sea is not a barrier but a road. Fishermen who once ventured only within sight of shore begin to read wind patterns and seasonal currents to navigate by headland and star. The cedar forests shape everything. They provide building material for houses and boats alike. They draw foreign wealth to an otherwise unremarkable strip of coast. They established the principle that will define Phoenician civilization for millennia to come, that raw materials, transformed by skill and transported by sea, generate power far exceeding what the land alone could provide. The narrow coastal plain offers almost nothing in arable farmland compared to the great river valleys of Egypt or Mesopotamia. Yet this very limitation becomes a catalyst, pushing these early Canaanite communities toward the water, toward trade, toward a destiny written not in soil, but in salt spray and timber resin. The mountains stand at their backs. The open Mediterranean stretches before them, vast and full of possibility. That possibility takes its first concrete form in the relationship between Byblos and the Nile Valley. By 2,500 years before the Common Era, a partnership has crystallized between this modest Levantine port and the most powerful kingdom on earth, a partnership built on a single irreplaceable commodity. Egypt needs wood. The Nile Delta produces papyrus, flax, and grain in staggering abundance, but it grows almost no timber suitable for large-scale construction. The sycamore and acacia of the valley yield short, knotted planks inadequate for the great barges that carry obelisks downriver, or the seagoing vessels that project pharaonic authority across the eastern Mediterranean. For this, Egypt turns to the cedars of Lebanon, and the gateway to those forests is Byblos. The harbor at Byblos during this period is a crescent of sandstone wharves sheltered by a natural headland. Warehouses of mud brick and limestone line the waterfront, their floors stained dark with resin from stacked timber. Cedar logs, stripped of bark and squared by bronze adzes, rest in the shallows, awaiting loading onto broad-beamed Egyptian cargo ships. The Egyptians call these vessels Byblos ships, a designation so specific it becomes a standard nautical term in pharaonic records. The Palermo stone, among the oldest royal annals of Egypt, records that Pharaoh Sneferu dispatches 40 such ships in a single expedition, returning laden with cedar for temple doors, flagpoles, and the great funerary boats buried beside the pyramids at Giza. The wealth flowing back into Byblos transforms the city from a prosperous fishing town into something unprecedented along this coast, a cosmopolitan center where Canaanite and Egyptian cultures intertwine. The temple of Baalat Gebal, the Lady of Byblos, rises on a limestone promontory overlooking the harbor. Its architecture blends local Canaanite traditions with unmistakable Egyptian influences. Obelisk-shaped standing stones alongside nilotic offering vessels, alabaster jars inscribed with hieroglyphs placed beside Canaanite votive figurines of bronze and clay. Egyptian pharaohs send gifts to this temple as diplomatic offerings, acknowledging Baalat Gebal as a goddess worthy of royal attention, perhaps identifying her with their own Hathor. Excavations at Byblos reveal the sheer density of Egyptian presence. Fragments of stone vessels bearing the cartouches of Old Kingdom and Middle Kingdom pharaohs appear in nearly every archaeological layer from this period. Gold and obsidian, faience amulets shaped as scarabs and lotus blossoms, sheets of papyrus rolled and sealed with royal clay impressions. These objects fill storage rooms and temple deposits. The city becomes so closely associated with papyrus imports that the Greeks will eventually derive their word for book, biblos, from its name, a linguistic echo that persists into the modern word Bible. Yet this is no colonial relationship. Byblos retains its own rulers, its own religious practices, its own Canaanite identity. The local kings adopt certain Egyptian symbols of authority, the uraeus cobra, the ceremonial mace, but they govern independently, mediating between the insatiable Egyptian demand for timber and the mountain communities that fell and transport the great trees. They grow skilled at something that will become a defining Phoenician talent, positioning themselves as indispensable intermediaries, profiting not merely from what they produce, but from what they move between civilizations. The trade routes radiating from Byblos during these centuries extend beyond Egypt. Copper from Cyprus, obsidian from Anatolia, lapis lazuli that has traveled overland from Afghanistan, all pass through the city's warehouses. Byblos functions as a node in a web of exchange that stretches thousands of kilometers, connecting the Nile with Mesopotamia, the Aegean with the Arabian Peninsula. The harbor smells of pine pitch and brine. Dock workers haul amphorae of olive oil and wine alongside bundles of dyed wool. The rhythms of international commerce establish themselves here, in this small city pressed between mountains and sea, 5 centuries before the great palaces of Minoan Crete reach their zenith. A pattern is being set. Wealth comes not from territorial expansion, but from connection, from the patient and profitable art of linking distant worlds. That pattern now ripples southward along the coast. By 2,000 years before the Common Era, the narrow Levantine littoral is no longer the domain of Byblos alone. Other settlements, older than memory but long overshadowed, begin to assert themselves with a confidence born of shifting geopolitics and expanding trade. Sidon occupies a low promontory jutting into the sea roughly 40 kilometers south of Byblos, its twin harbors, one facing north, one south, offering shelter from winds in every season. Tyre sits farther still, another 40 kilometers down the coast, split between a mainland settlement and a cluster of rocky islands half a kilometer offshore. Both cities have existed for centuries as modest fishing and farming communities. Now they grow into something altogether different. The Middle Bronze Age transforms the Levantine coast into a corridor of fortified urban centers. Massive rampart walls of packed earth and stone rise around Sidon, their sloped glacis designed to deflect battering rams and repel scaling ladders. The engineering is sophisticated, layers of compacted fill faced with plaster, creating defensive slopes that gleam white under the Mediterranean sun. Tyre's island position provides a natural moat, but even here, sea walls of fitted limestone blocks are constructed to protect harbor approaches. These are not villages anymore. They are cities built for permanence and prepared for war. The impetus is partly defensive. The second millennium before the Common Era is an age of ambitious powers. Egyptian influence waxes and wanes along the coast. Amorite kingdoms press from the interior. Nomadic groups probe the mountain passes. The cities of the shore must protect their warehouses, their workshops, their accumulating wealth. But fortification also signals political maturity. Each city operates under its own king, its own patron deity, its own council of merchant elders. Sidon venerates Astarte, goddess of fertility and the sea. Tyre consecrates itself to Melkart, the divine king of the city, whose temple becomes the spiritual anchor of an increasingly powerful maritime state. Commerce drives the transformation. Cypriot copper, essential for bronze production, flows through Sidonian and Tyrian harbors in quantities that reshape regional economies. Phoenician merchants establish regular routes to Encome and Kition on Cyprus, exchanging finished textiles, carved ivory, and perfumed oils for raw metal ingots shaped like dried ox hides. The ceramic record tells the story plainly. Canaanite storage jars appear in Cypriot tombs and Cypriot pottery surfaces in Sidonian warehouses. Farther west, the first tentative contacts with Minoan Crete emerge. Kamares were from Cretan workshops reaches the Levantine coast, evidence of a nascent exchange network stretching across open water. Shipbuilding advances to meet these demands. The vessels grow larger, their cedar hulls reinforced with mortise and tenon joinery that allows them to withstand the stresses of longer voyages. Keels are cut from single trunks of Lebanon cedar, the straight grain and natural resin resistance making the timber ideal for ocean-going craft. Harbors are improved with stone quays and breakwaters, creating protected anchorages where ships can load and unload regardless of weather. The cities develop specialized industries. Bronze weapons, daggers, spearheads, socketed axes are produced in quantities that suggest export as well as local use. Goldsmiths work with granulation and filigree techniques absorbed from Egyptian and Mesopotamian traditions, creating jewelry that blends multiple artistic vocabularies into something distinctly Canaanite. Pottery workshops produce elegant bichrome ware, vessels painted in red and black geometric patterns that will become diagnostic markers of Levantine trade wherever they appear across the eastern Mediterranean. Between Sidon and Tyre, smaller settlements thrive. Sarepta with its olive presses and ceramic kilns, Berytus with its sheltered bay and agricultural hinterland. The coast functions as an interconnected chain of specialized ports, each contributing to a collective commercial enterprise that no single city could sustain alone. This is the essential Phoenician innovation taking shape centuries before the name Phoenicia exists, not a centralized empire but a network, a constellation of independent cities bound by shared language, shared gods, and shared profit. The mountains at their backs make territorial expansion impractical. The sea before them makes it unnecessary. Every horizon is an invitation. Every horizon is an invitation, but by 1,500 years before the Common Era, the greatest power in the known world has already accepted it. Egypt's new kingdom pharaohs extend their dominion northward along the Levantine coast, and the Phoenician cities, prosperous, strategically vital, militarily modest, find themselves drawn into the orbit of an empire whose reach stretches from Nubia to the Euphrates. Egyptian garrisons occupy key positions along the coastal road. Governors appointed by the pharaoh oversee tribute collection. The cedar trade that once flowed as commerce between equals now moves under imperial supervision, and the harbors of Byblos, Sidon, Tyre, and Berytus operate within a framework dictated by the palace at Thebes. Yet domination is not destruction. The Phoenician cities retain their local rulers, their temples, their merchant fleets. Egypt needs these ports functioning, needs their skilled sailors and their irreplaceable timber. The relationship is asymmetric but symbiotic. Phoenician workshops produce luxury goods, carved ivory boxes, gold-inlaid bronze vessels, faience beads of extraordinary delicacy that flow southward to adorn Egyptian courts. In return, grain, papyrus, and gold move northward. The coastal cities grow wealthier even under the imperial yoke, their artisans absorbing Egyptian motifs and blending them with Mesopotamian and Aegean influences into a hybrid aesthetic that becomes distinctly their own. From the north, another shadow falls. The Hittite Empire, centered in Anatolia, presses southward through Syria, and the Phoenician coast becomes contested ground between two superpowers. The Battle of Kadesh around 1274 before the Common Era, fought between Rameses II and the Hittite king Muwatalli II, leaves the border unresolved for years. The Phoenician cities navigate this geopolitical fault line with extraordinary pragmatism, offering loyalty to whichever power controls their immediate hinterland while maintaining commercial ties with both. The Amarna letters, a cache of cuneiform tablets discovered in Egypt, open a window into this precarious world. Written around 1350 before the Common Era, these diplomatic dispatches include urgent correspondence from Rib-Hadda, ruler of Byblos, who sends dozens of increasingly desperate appeals to Pharaoh Akhenaten, begging for military reinforcements against encroaching rivals. The tablets reveal a coastal landscape of shifting alliances, petty conflicts between neighboring kings, and the constant anxiety of small states caught between titanic forces. Zimrida of Sidon maneuvers against Byblos. Abimilki of Tyre reports on naval movements and political intrigues. Each letter is inscribed in Akkadian cuneiform, the diplomatic lingua franca of the age, pressed into small clay tablets that fit in the palm of a hand, yet carry the weight of kingdoms. The late Bronze Age international system that these letters document is astonishingly interconnected. Phoenician ships carry Cypriot copper and Mycenaean pottery alongside Egyptian gold and Mesopotamian cylinder seals. Ugarit, the great port to the north, serves as a nexus where cuneiform, hieroglyphic, and early alphabetic scripts coexist on the same archive shelves. Trade routes link the Aegean to the Persian Gulf through a web of palace-sponsored exchange. Phoenician harbors are essential nodes in this network, their warehouses stacked with goods from a dozen cultures, their shipwrights building vessels capable of crossing open water to Crete and beyond. This is the crucible in which Phoenician identity sharpens. Centuries of navigating between empires cultivate diplomatic sophistication, commercial adaptability, and a talent for cultural synthesis that will define these cities long after the empires themselves have crumbled. The Phoenician rulers learn that survival belongs not to the strongest, but to the most indispensable. They make themselves essential as shipbuilders, as intermediaries, as producers of goods no empire can manufacture alone. The purple dye, the cedar beams, the ivory carvings, the glass, these are not merely trade goods, but instruments of political survival. And when the great empires begin to falter, when the elaborate international system starts to fracture under pressures no palace can contain, these coastal cities will possess something their imperial overlords do not: the resilience of the irreplaceable. That resilience is tested now as it has never been tested before. Around 1200 years before the Common Era, the world breaks apart. The catastrophe arrives not as a single blow, but as a cascade of failures: drought, famine, internal rebellion, disrupted trade routes, and waves of migrating peoples whose origins remain debated by scholars to this day. The great powers that have dominated the eastern Mediterranean for centuries begin to collapse with a speed that must have seemed apocalyptic to those who witnessed it. The Hittite Empire, that vast Anatolian dominion whose treaties and armies shaped Levantine politics for generations, simply ceases to exist. Its capital at Hattusa burns. The palace archives fall silent. Across the Aegean, the Mycenaean citadels at Tyrins and Mycenae crumble. The palatial economies of Crete and mainland Greece dissolve into centuries of illiteracy and depopulation. Egypt survives but contracts, its pharaohs fighting desperate battles against confederations of raiders whom the temple inscriptions at Medinet Habu call the Sea Peoples, Peliset, Jekka, Shekelesh, Denian, Weshesh, names carved in stone by Rameses III around 1170 before the Common Era, commemorating a victory that nonetheless marks the end of Egyptian imperial reach into the Levant. The destruction is selective, but devastating. Ugarit, that prosperous port city to the north, whose scribes mastered multiple languages and cuneiform traditions, is obliterated around 1185. Its final clay tablets record frantic pleas for military assistance that never arrives. The city never recovers. Its ruins lie buried under ash and collapsed mud brick, a frozen testament to the speed of annihilation. Along the Levantine coast, smaller settlements burn. Inland kingdoms fragment. The elaborate international trading system that connected Egypt to Mesopotamia to Anatolia to the Aegean, the system that sustained Byblos and enriched Sidon, shatters like a ceramic vessel dropped on stone. Yet the Phoenician heartland cities endure. Byblos, Sidon, Tyre, and the island fortress of Arwad to the north emerge from the catastrophe battered but intact. The reasons are multiple and intertwined. Their island and peninsula positions offer natural defensive advantages that inland cities lack. Their populations are maritime, accustomed to flexibility and movement. Their economies, though damaged by the collapse of long-distance trade, retain the fundamental resources: cedar timber, purple dye, skilled seamanship, that make rebuilding possible. The archaeological record at Tyre shows continuity through the crisis. Occupation layers from the 12th and 11th centuries before the Common Era reveal no destruction horizon comparable to Ugarit's. Instead, there is adaptation. Iron tools begin appearing alongside bronze implements. Pottery styles shift, absorbing influences from displaced populations settling along the coast. The harbors remain active, though the volume of trade contracts sharply in the decades immediately following the collapse. What emerges from this crucible is something genuinely new. With Egyptian garrisons withdrawn and Hittite authority extinguished, the Phoenician cities find themselves independent for the first time in centuries. No imperial overlord demands tribute or dictates foreign policy. The vacuum is immense, and into it flows Phoenician ambition. Sidon rises to particular prominence during this transitional period, its sailors probing westward across waters no longer patrolled by Mycenaean fleets. Tyre consolidates its island defenses and expands its harbor infrastructure. Byblos, though diminished from its former glory as Egypt's favored partner, maintains its sacred traditions and its reputation as the oldest continuously inhabited city on the coast. The collapse destroys the old world but clears the sea lanes for a new one. The palace-controlled economies that once monopolized long-distance exchange are gone. In their place, a more decentralized, merchant-driven model begins to crystallize, one perfectly suited to independent city-states whose wealth depends not on territorial conquest, but on the movement of goods across open water. The Phoenician cities do not merely survive the Bronze Age collapse. They inherit its aftermath, stepping into a Mediterranean emptied of rivals, their ships provisioned with cedar, their holds stained with purple, their navigators reading stars that guide them toward horizons no competitor remains strong enough to contest. Into that emptied world, sometime around 1050 before the Common Era, a quiet revolution begins, not in a palace throne room or on the deck of a warship, but in the modest workshops of Byblos, where craftsmen scratch marks into wet clay and limestone with the tips of bronze styluses. The marks are spare, angular, stripped of every flourish that made earlier writing systems the exclusive province of trained scribes who spent lifetimes mastering hundreds or thousands of signs. These new marks number only 22. The achievement is not creation from nothing. For centuries, Proto-Canaanite scripts have circulated along the Levantine coast and in the turquoise mines of Sinai, borrowing pictographic inspiration from Egyptian hieroglyphs, but simplifying radically, reducing images to sounds. An ox head becomes a leph, a breath of air, a glottal stop. A house floor plan becomes beth, the sound of lips pressing together. A thrown stick becomes gimel. Each symbol no longer represents a word or a syllable or an idea. It represents a single consonant, a building block of speech itself. The genius lies not in what the system contains, but in what it discards. Gone are the elaborate logograms of Mesopotamian cuneiform, requiring years of palace-sponsored education. Gone are the hundreds of hieroglyphic signs that kept Egyptian literacy confined to a priestly caste. 22 letters can be learned in weeks, scratched onto potsherds, carved into stone, inked onto papyrus. Writing ceases to be a mystery guarded by temple elites and becomes a tool available to any merchant tallying a cargo manifest, any captain recording a route, any artisan marking ownership on a finished vessel. The oldest substantial inscription in this mature Phoenician script survives on the limestone sarcophagus of King Ahiram of Byblos, dating to approximately the 10th century before the Common Era. The carved letters run along the edge of the coffin's lid in a continuous line, right to left, warning that any ruler or governor who disturbs the burial will have his scepter broken and his throne overturned. The craftsmanship of the sarcophagus itself is remarkable. Its relief panels depict a seated king receiving offerings, flanked by lotus flowers and mourning figures. But the inscription matters more than the imagery. It demonstrates a fully standardized script, consistent letter forms, and a syntax confident enough for formal royal declaration. This is no experimental notation. It is a mature system already embedded in the administrative and ceremonial life of the city. From Byblos, the alphabet radiates outward with Phoenician commerce. Merchants carry it to Cyprus, to the Aegean coast, to North Africa. The Greeks encounter it, probably through trading contacts at ports like Almina on the Orontes, and adapt it with a transformative addition. They repurpose consonantal signs unused in Greek phonology to represent vowels, creating the first fully phonetic alphabet. Alpha, beta, gamma, the names themselves are Phoenician words, aleph, beth, gimel, transplanted into a new tongue. From Greek, the system passes to Etruscan, then to Latin, and eventually to the scripts that billions of human beings use today. Yet in the Phoenician homeland around 950 before the Common Era, the alphabet serves immediate practical needs. Harbour masters inventory shipments of cedar, copper ingots, and amphorae of wine. Temple administrators record dedications and offerings to Balat Gabal, the Lady of Byblos. Seal makers carve names into carnelian and steatite for merchants who stamp their identity onto clay stoppers sealing traded goods. The scribal workshops of Byblos and Sidon are modest rooms, their floors littered with practice shards, their walls stained with lamp soot. No grand academies are necessary. The alphabet's power is its simplicity, its portability, its democracy. A trader's son can master it alongside his father's business. A shipwright can label timber grades. A dyer can mark vats by client name. This is the gift that outlasts every temple, every fleet, every purple-stained textile the Phoenicians will ever produce. 22 letters, compact enough to carry in memory, flexible enough to encode any language that borrows them. The narrow coastal cities have given the world something more durable than cedar and more valuable than murex dye, a technology of thought itself, portable and imperishable, already spreading along every trade route their ships have opened. And now those letters ride aboard ships built from the very cedars that first drew Egypt's attention to this coast, ships that carry Tyre's ambitions farther than any Phoenician city has dared reach before. Around 980 years before the Common Era, a king named Hiram ascends to power in Tyre, and under his reign the island city undergoes a transformation so thorough that it becomes the undisputed capital of Phoenician civilization. The geography of Tyre itself explains much. The city occupies a rocky island roughly half a mile offshore, separated from the mainland by a channel of open water that renders conventional siege tactics nearly useless. Hiram recognizes this natural fortress and enhances it with engineering on a monumental scale. He expands the island's usable surface by filling in the shallow eastern channel with rubble and imported stone, creating new land where warehouses and shipyards rise. Two harbors take shape, the Sidonian harbor facing north, open to traffic from the Phoenician heartland, and the Egyptian harbor facing south toward Africa and the Nile Delta. Between them, the city compresses itself into a dense vertical landscape of multi-story buildings, some reaching 5 or 6 floors according to later accounts, their flat rooftops forming a secondary streetscape above the narrow lanes below. At the island's highest point, Hiram commissions the reconstruction of the Temple of Melkart, Tyre's patron deity, the god of the city and the sea, and the cycle of death and renewal. Twin columns of gold and emerald green stone flank the entrance, gleaming in the Mediterranean light. The temple becomes the spiritual anchor of an expanding commercial empire, because Melkart travels wherever Tyrian merchants travel, his cult established in every colony and trading post as a sacred franchise binding distant settlements to the mother city. Hiram's most celebrated partnership reaches inland rather than across the sea. Around 960 years before the Common Era, an alliance forms between Tyre and the Kingdom of Israel under Solomon. The arrangement is pragmatic and mutually enriching. Solomon controls overland trade routes connecting Arabia and Mesopotamia to the Mediterranean coast. Hiram controls the sea lanes, the shipbuilding expertise, and the finest craftsmen in the known world. Cedar and cypress logs descend from the Lebanon mountains, floated south along the coast in great rafts to the port of Joppa, then hauled overland to Jerusalem. Tyrian stonemasons, bronze workers, and wood carvers follow the timber. The Temple of Solomon rises over 7 years, its interior lined with cedar panels carved with gourds and open flowers, its great bronze pillars cast by a Tyrian master metalworker. In return, Solomon provides wheat and pressed olive oil, 20,000 measures of wheat, and 20 measures of fine oil annually, along with access to the Red Sea trade through the port of Ezion-Geber. Joint Tyrian-Israelite expeditions sail from there to the land of Ophir, returning with gold, almug wood, and precious stones. The partnership transforms both kingdoms, channeling the wealth of 3 continents through a single commercial axis. The harbour of Tyre hums with this prosperity. Cedar-hulled merchant vessels sit low in the water under cargoes of dyed textiles, carved ivory, blown glass, and amphoras of wine. Shipwrights caulk planking with pine resin in dry docks carved from the island's bedrock. The smell of murex processing drifts from the mainland shore where the dye works operate, kept at a distance from the residential quarters because the stench of rotting shellfish is overwhelming. Hiram reigns for approximately 34 years, and by the time of his death around 935 years before the Common Era, Tyre has become something unprecedented, a city-state whose influence stretches from the mountains of Lebanon to the copper mines of Cyprus, from the courts of Israel to the harbours of the western Mediterranean. The island fortress, barely 1,000 paces across, commands a trade network spanning the entire known world. Its wealth is not measured in conquered territory, but in relationships, roots, and the irreplaceable expertise of its people. That wealth now flows through a substance so precious that a single pound of cloth dyed in its deepest shade commands a price equivalent to its weight in silver. Along the shoreline south of Tyre's island citadel, stretching for hundreds of paces, the processing grounds sprawl in a landscape unlike anything else in the ancient world. Mountains of crushed murex shells rise in pale, calcified heaps, some reaching the height of a man, accumulated over generations of relentless harvesting. The smell is staggering, a thick biological rot that saturates the air for miles. Yet within this repulsive industry lies the foundation of Phoenicia's most enduring fortune. 2 species of predatory sea snail drive the trade. The banded murex yields a reddish-violet hue, while the rock murex produces a bluer tone. Workers crack open each shell by hand, extracting a tiny hypobranchial gland no larger than a grain of rice. Thousands of snails yield mere drops of usable secretion. The fluid itself begins as a yellowish-white mucus, unremarkable to the eye. Only through a precise chemical transformation, exposure to sunlight, the addition of aged urine or wood ash as a reducing agent, and days of controlled heating in stone vats, does the substance undergo its metamorphosis into the legendary color. The vats themselves are sunken basins lined with plaster, some large enough to hold several hundred liters of liquid. Archaeological remains at Sidon and along the coast near Sarepta reveal these installations dating to the mid-10th century before the Common Era, operating at a scale that suggests organized industrial production rather than artisanal craft. The dye lots simmer for days at carefully maintained temperatures. Workers stir the mixture with long wooden paddles, their hands and forearms permanently stained to the elbow in shades ranging from violet to near black. Their skin carries the mark of their trade for life. The resulting pigment possesses qualities no other ancient dye can match. It does not fade in sunlight. It resists washing. With each exposure to light and air, the color actually deepens and intensifies rather than diminishing. A garment dyed in true Tyrian purple grows more beautiful with age, a property so remarkable that it seems almost supernatural to ancient buyers. The finest double-dyed cloth, first soaked in the reddish extract, then overdyed in the blue, achieves a luminous blackish crimson that shimmers with an almost iridescent quality in shifting light. By 900 years before the Common Era, this color has become the universal signifier of supreme authority across the eastern Mediterranean. Assyrian kings demand purple textiles as tribute. Egyptian priests reserve it for temple vestments. The courts of Cyprus and the Aegean kingdoms pay extraordinary sums for bolts of Tyrian cloth. No competing source exists. The specific combination of murex species, coastal water chemistry, and generations of accumulated technical knowledge makes the Phoenician monopoly virtually unbreakable. The textile workshops operate in a chain of production that links the shellfish divers and breakers to the dye workers, then to the spinners and weavers who prepare wool and linen for immersion. Finished cloth moves into warehouse districts along the harbors of Tyre and Sidon, where merchants grade and price each bolt according to depth of color, evenness of saturation, and quality of weave. The most prized pieces enter sealed storage for export aboard Phoenician cargo vessels, the broad-bellied merchant ships that fan out across established routes to Cyprus, Rhodes, Crete, and the emerging western colonies. The trade reshapes the coastal economy entirely. Fishing communities that once harvested murex as a minor supplement now organize their entire seasonal labor around the snail beds. Divers work the rocky shallows with wicker traps baited with carrion, hauling up catches by the thousands. The shell middens grow year after year, geological in their accumulation, compressing under their own weight into dense strata that will endure for 3 millennia. Purple becomes more than a commodity. It becomes identity itself, the very name the Greeks will eventually assign to this entire civilization derives from their word for the color, Phoenix, the purple people. The dye defines them in the eyes of every culture they encounter, a chromatic signature as distinctive as their ships or their letters. The stench of the processing vats and the radiance of the finished cloth exist as two faces of the same extraordinary achievement, beauty extracted from decay, fortune built upon the patient crushing of 10,000 shells for a single garment worthy of kings. Those ships now push further than any Mediterranean vessel has ventured before. By 900 years before the Common Era, the Phoenician mastery of purple and cedar and alphabet converges upon a single, supreme ambition, the conquest of distance itself. The shipyards of Tyre and Sidon hum with an industry refined across generations. Cedar trunks descend from the Lebanon mountains on sledges, arriving at coastal yards where shipwrights split them into planks with bronze wedges and copper saws. The keel is laid first, a single timber running the vessel's full length, carved from the straightest trunk available. Ribs rise from this spine in close intervals, and planks are fitted edge to edge using mortise and tenon joints, each connection locked with hardwood pegs driven tight and sealed with pine resin and beeswax. The result is a hull of extraordinary integrity, flexible enough to absorb open ocean swells, yet rigid enough to bear heavy cargo. Two principal vessel types emerge from these yards. The Byblos, a broad-beamed merchant ship with a deep, rounded hull, carries amphorae of wine, bundles of dyed cloth, ingots of tin and copper, and crates of ivory. Its single square sail, woven from linen and suspended from a cedar yard, catches the prevailing westerlies that blow reliably across the Mediterranean from spring through autumn. The second type is the long warship, the bireme, with 2 banks of oars stacked along each flank, built for speed and coastal defense rather than cargo capacity. Its ram, sheathed in bronze, extends forward at the waterline like the beak of a predatory bird. But the true Phoenician innovation is not the ship itself. It is the willingness to sail beyond sight of land. Other maritime peoples, Egyptians, Mycenaeans, Cretans, hug the coastline, navigating by landmark and daylight. Phoenician captains read the night sky. The constellation the Greeks will later call Ursa Minor, the Little Bear, becomes their cardinal reference. Its pole star hangs nearly motionless above the northern horizon, while the heavens wheel around it, offering a fixed point from which bearing and latitude can be estimated even in open water. The Greeks themselves will eventually call this constellation the Phoenician star, in acknowledgement of who first trusted it for deep water navigation. Coastal piloting remains essential for approaches and departures. Captains memorize headland profiles, the color shifts of shallowing water, the behavior of currents around promontories. Knowledge passes orally from master to apprentice, an unwritten encyclopedia of wind patterns, seasonal storm cycles, and safe anchorages accumulated across centuries. No Phoenician navigation manual survives, yet the routes themselves testify to the sophistication of the knowledge that charted them. By 850 years before the Common Era, these routes stretch across the entire Mediterranean basin. Ships depart Tyre laden with purple textiles and glass beads, make landfall at Kition on Cyprus for copper ingots, then press westward past Crete to the harbours of Sicily and Sardinia. From Sardinia, the boldest captains continue to the Iberian coast, reaching Gadir beyond the Pillars of Hercules, where Atlantic tides surge through the narrow strait and silver flows from Tartessian mines. Along the North African shore, a chain of anchorages spaced at intervals of roughly a single day's sailing provides rest, fresh water, and trading opportunities with indigenous populations. Each voyage follows the rhythm of the sailing season. Departures concentrate between April and October, when Mediterranean weather permits reliable passage. Winter months confine fleets to harbour, where hulls are careened, scraped clean of barnacles, and recorked. The cedar wood resists rot better than most available timbers, but constant maintenance remains essential for vessels that spend months at sea. The distances are staggering for the age. From Tyre to Gadir stretches more than 4,000 kilometers of coastline. A one-way voyage under favorable conditions takes roughly 2 months. The return journey, beating against prevailing winds, often requires longer. Yet these passages become routine, repeated annually by fleets whose captains navigate not by written chart, but by stars, experience, and an intimate reading of the sea itself, its colors, its moods, its ancient and reliable patterns. Those routine passages now leave permanent marks upon distant shores. By 850 years before the Common Era, the pattern shifts decisively. What begins as seasonal anchorages, places where crews beach their vessels, trade with local populations, and wait for favorable winds, hardens into something more enduring. Stone foundations replace temporary shelters. Warehouses rise beside natural harbors. Temples to Melkart and Astarte consecrate foreign ground as sacred Phoenician space. The trading post becomes the colony. The transformation follows a recognizable logic. A sheltered bay with fresh water attracts the first merchants. They return season after season, storing amphorae of wine and oil in rough-built sheds. Local chieftains grow accustomed to Phoenician goods, bronze fibulae, glass beads, fine textiles dyed in graduated shades of purple. Intermarriage begins. Children grow up speaking 2 languages. Within a generation, the anchorage has streets, a harbour mole constructed from quarried stone, and a small precinct where incense burns before carved stelae. Kition on the southeastern coast of Cyprus exemplifies this evolution. Already inhabited by local populations, the site receives Phoenician settlers who rebuild the old temple complex on a monumental scale. Massive ashlar blocks form the sanctuary walls. Copper from the island's rich mines flows through Kition's workshops, smelted and cast into ingots shaped for export. The city becomes a permanent Phoenician stronghold, its harbour capable of sheltering an entire merchant fleet during winter storms. Far to the west, Motia occupies a small island in a shallow lagoon off Sicily's western coast, a location chosen with characteristic Phoenician precision. The lagoon provides natural protection. A narrow causeway connects the island to the mainland. Within its modest perimeter, Motia develops dense urban infrastructure. A kothon, or artificial inner harbour, carved directly from the island's bedrock, allows ships to be hauled inside the city walls for repair and loading. Warehouses line the waterfront. A Tophet sanctuary stands at the settlement's northern edge, its limestone stele marking offerings to Tanit and Baal Hammon. Along the Atlantic coast of Morocco, Lixus rises on a hill overlooking the river Lukos. Its position commands both river trade into the African interior and maritime access to Atlantic fishing grounds. The waters off this coast teem with tuna, and Phoenician settlers establish processing facilities where fish are salted and packed into amphorae for export across the Mediterranean. Gadda, founded perhaps a generation earlier on the southwestern tip of Iberia, anchors the western extreme of this network. The city occupies a narrow island separated from the mainland by a tidal channel. Its temple to Melkart, reportedly containing 2 great bronze columns, becomes a landmark for sailors entering the Atlantic. Silver and tin flow through Gadia's markets, metals sourced from mines deep in the Iberian interior, carried downriver by local Tartessian traders who exchange raw ore for Phoenician manufactured goods. The architectural vocabulary remains remarkably consistent across thousands of kilometers. Rectangular temples with open courtyards, flat-roofed domestic structures built from local stone but following Levantine floor plans, harbors engineered with protective moles and interior basins, burial grounds where rock-cut shaft tombs hold terracotta sarcophagi alongside Egyptian scarabs, Greek pottery, and indigenous ornaments, material evidence of lives lived at the intersection of multiple worlds. Each colony maintains religious and cultural ties to the mother cities. Tyre's authority carries particular weight. Annual tribute or temple offerings flow eastward, acknowledging the spiritual primacy of Melkart's great sanctuary. Yet the colonies also develop autonomous identities. Local conditions shape local adaptations. Motia's Kothon has no parallel in Tyre. Gadda's Atlantic orientation creates trade relationships unknown along the Levantine coast. By 750 years before the Common Era, this network spans the entire Mediterranean basin and reaches beyond it into the Atlantic. No single political authority governs it. No imperial army enforces its coherence. It holds together through shared language, shared gods, shared commercial interest, and the cedar-hulled ships that shuttle continuously between its scattered harbors, carrying not only goods but also techniques, artistic motifs, religious practices, and those 22 letters that make accounting, correspondence, and cultural memory portable across any distance the sea allows. Among those scattered harbors, one destination begins to eclipse all others. In 814 years before the Common Era, a fleet departs Tyre under circumstances that have nothing to do with routine commerce. The ships carry not trade goods but refugees, members of the royal household fleeing political violence after King Pygmalion murders the high priest Acabas and seizes his wealth. At the head of this exodus stands Elissa, sister of the king, wife of the slain priest, a woman who chooses exile over submission. The fleet touches Cyprus first, where priests of Astarte join the voyage, then turns westward across open water toward the North African coast. The landing site lies on a peninsula jutting into the Gulf of Tunis, a position of extraordinary natural advantage. A sheltered lagoon opens to the south. Deep water approaches from the east. The peninsula itself narrows to a defensible neck of land barely wide enough for a wall. The Phoenician eye for harbor geography, refined across centuries of colonial expansion, recognizes immediately what this place offers. The legend of the founding preserves itself in the name Byrsa, the citadel hill. Local Libyan chieftains grant the newcomers only as much land as an ox hide can cover. Elissa orders the hide cut into the thinnest possible strips, which laid end to end encircled the entire hilltop. Whether historical memory or later invention, the story captures something essential about Phoenician civilization: the conviction that cleverness outperforms brute force, that negotiation and ingenuity solve problems that armies cannot. The settlement rises quickly. Limestone quarried from the hillside forms foundation walls. Mud brick construction follows homeland patterns, flat roofs, interior courtyards, narrow streets descending toward the waterfront. A sacred precinct dedicated to Tanit and Baal Hammon occupies elevated ground. The Tophet, that enigmatic sanctuary where urns containing cremated remains accumulate over generations, begins receiving its earliest deposits within decades of the founding. The harbor defines everything. Twin ports eventually take shape, a rectangular commercial basin and a circular military kothon, though in these earliest decades the natural lagoon serves both purposes. Warehouses line the quays. Ships arriving from Tyre, Sidon, and the older western colonies at Utica and Hadrumetum discharge cargoes of purple-dyed textiles, ivory carvings, and metalwork. They load African gold, animal hides, grain, and the agricultural surplus of the fertile Tunisian hinterland. What distinguishes Carthage from earlier Phoenician settlements is the speed and scale of its transformation. Motia remains a trading island. Gadir stays oriented toward Atlantic metals. But Carthage develops political ambitions that match its commercial ones. Within a century of its founding, the city negotiates treaties with indigenous Libyan populations, absorbs neighboring settlements, and begins projecting influence across the western Mediterranean. The refugee colony becomes a sovereign power. By 700 years before the Common Era, Carthage controls the most strategic position in the central Mediterranean. Every ship passing between the eastern and western basins sails within reach of its fleet. The grain fields stretching inland provide food security that island Tyre, dependent on mainland agriculture, perpetually lacks. The Libyan hinterland offers manpower for armies and labor for construction projects that steadily expand the urban footprint beyond the original Byrsa perimeter. The relationship with the mother city evolves but never entirely severs. Annual tribute ships carry offerings to the temple of Melkart in Tyre, honoring the divine patron of the homeland. Tyrian religious festivals mark the Carthaginian calendar. The Punic language spoken in North African markets remains mutually intelligible with the Phoenician of the Levantine coast. Yet the daughter city increasingly charts its own course, developing institutions, military traditions, and territorial ambitions that Tyre itself never possessed. The narrow coastal civilization that learned to read the stars and cut letters into stone has now planted something new on African soil, not merely another trading post, but the seed of an empire. That seed takes root in African soil, even as the homeland faces a threat unlike any it has known. From the east, beyond the Euphrates, the Assyrian war machine turns its gaze toward the Mediterranean coast with a hunger that neither diplomacy nor tribute can permanently satisfy. In 744 years before the Common Era, Tiglath-Pileser III ascends the Assyrian throne and immediately reorganizes the empire's military apparatus into the most formidable fighting force the ancient world has yet produced. Iron-shod battering rams, siege towers clad in dampened leather, disciplined infantry numbering in the tens of thousands. This is an army engineered for the systematic reduction of walled cities. Within 2 years, Assyrian columns march westward. The Phoenician coast, with its legendary wealth in purple dye, cedar timber, and maritime commerce, represents an irresistible prize. Byblos submits first, then Arwad. Tribute lists carved into limestone slabs at the palace of Nimrud enumerate the payments extracted: gold, silver, linen garments, ivory, and the precious purple cloth that Assyrian kings drape across their own shoulders. Tyre negotiates. Its island position, separated from the mainland by a channel of deep water, grants a strategic advantage no other Phoenician city possesses. Assyrian armies can devastate the mainland suburbs, burn the warehouses along the continental shore, but the island citadel remains beyond the reach of siege engines that cannot cross open water. Tiglath-Pileser accepts Tyrian tribute rather than attempt the impossible show, a full amphibious assault against the greatest naval power in the Mediterranean. The arrangement proves fragile. When Shalmaneser V takes power in 727 before the Common Era, Tyre's King Luli attempts to break free of tributary obligations. The Assyrian response is swift. Mainland territories fall under direct occupation. A naval blockade, assembled from ships conscripted from the already subjugated ports of Sidon, Byblos, and Arwad, attempts to strangle the island. Phoenician vessels turned against Phoenician vessels. The empire weaponizes the coast against itself. Yet Tyre's experienced sailors scatter the improvised blockade fleet, and the siege dissolves without a breach. The palace walls at Nineveh preserve the Assyrian perspective in carved alabaster relief panels of extraordinary detail. Phoenician biremes appear in stone, their curved prows and double banks of oars rendered with the precision of artists who studied captured vessels firsthand. Tribute-bearers walk in procession carrying bolts of fabric, metal ingots, and ornamental vessels. These carvings serve as imperial propaganda, projecting dominion over peoples who in reality remain only partially subdued. Sidon's fate proves far grimmer. In 677 before the Common Era, King Esarhaddon punishes Sidonian rebellion with absolute destruction. The city that once rivaled Tyre in wealth and prestige is razed to its foundations. Its population is deported to Assyria. On the ruins, Esarhaddon constructs a new settlement bearing his own name, a deliberate erasure of Phoenician identity, stamped into the very geography. The destruction sends tremors along the entire coast. Arwad capitulates immediately. Byblos renews its tribute without hesitation. Tyre endures again. Esarhaddon's successor Ashurbanipal maintains pressure, imposing harsh terms that restrict Tyrian trade and station Assyrian officials within the city's commercial districts. The once sovereign island kingdom becomes a monitored vassal, its merchants conducting business under imperial oversight, its ships sailing routes approved by foreign administrators. Cedar exports now flow eastward to furnish Assyrian palaces rather than Egyptian temples. Yet even diminished, the Phoenician cities retain something no empire can confiscate: their accumulated maritime knowledge, their artisan traditions, their alphabet spreading silently across the Mediterranean aboard every merchant vessel. The Assyrian storm batters the coast for over a century, reshaping political realities, demolishing walls, relocating populations. But the cultural infrastructure proves more resilient than stone. In workshops and harbors operating under foreign supervision, Phoenician craftsmen continue producing the goods the empire itself craves. The conqueror becomes dependent on the conquered, demanding the very skills and products that make subjugation profitable rather than merely punitive. When Assyria itself begins to fracture in the 630s before the Common Era, the Phoenician cities still stand along their ancient shore, battered and diminished, but carrying forward traditions that will outlast every empire that seeks to claim them. Those traditions rest upon foundations deeper than commerce or craft. Beneath every transaction sealed in a Phoenician harbor, beneath every voyage launched toward unknown shores, lies a sacred architecture of belief that permeates every dimension of coastal life from the 9th century through the 5th century before the Common Era. The gods of Phoenicia do not dwell in distant heavens. They inhabit the very stones of the waterfront, the flames of the smelting furnace, the salt wind that fills the sails. At Tyre, the great temple of Melkart dominates the island's sacred precinct. Twin pillars of gold and emerald green glass stand at its entrance, described by visitors with a reverence that suggests genuine astonishment. Melkart is the lord of the city, the divine king whose annual death and resurrection mirrors the agricultural and maritime cycles upon which Tyrian prosperity depends. Each spring, a ritual called the Agursis enacts his awakening. Fires burn on the temple's rooftop altar, and the scent of burning saffron and cedar resin drifts across the harbor basin. Melkart travels wherever Tyre's merchants travel. His cult appears at Carthage, at Gardir, at every colony that claims Tyrian parentage, binding the commercial network to a shared spiritual identity. At Sidon, Astarte reigns. Her temple complexes rise on elevated platforms overlooking the harbor, their limestone walls smoothed and painted in ochre and deep blue. Votive figurines recovered from her sanctuaries depict a goddess of fierce duality, associated simultaneously with love, fertility, war, and the evening star. Terracotta plaques show her enthroned, flanked by sphinxes, wearing an Egyptian-style crown adapted to Phoenician aesthetics. Sailors offer small bronze figurines before departure, seeking her protection on open water. Her worship extends across the Mediterranean, merging with Greek Aphrodite and later Roman Venus, carrying Phoenician sacred imagery into civilizations that barely recognize its origin. On the hillside above Sidon, the sanctuary of Eshmun occupies a terraced landscape fed by the Awali River. This healing god presides over a complex where the sick seek divine cure through ritual bathing, incense offerings, and the dedication of sculpted body parts representing afflicted limbs. Marble thrones line processional pathways. Mosaic floors depict pastoral scenes. The sanctuary functions as both hospital and holy ground, a place where physical suffering meets spiritual remedy in an integration characteristic of Phoenician religious thought. The divine hierarchy varies from city to city. Byblos venerates Balat Gebal, the Lady of Byblos, whose cult stretches back millennia. Berytus honors its own local Baal. Each city maintains its patron deity, while acknowledging the broader pantheon, creating a religious landscape of local devotion within shared theological frameworks. Temples serve simultaneously as banks, storehouses, and diplomatic centers, their treasuries holding dedications from foreign kings alongside humble fishermen's offerings. The most contested element of Phoenician religion remains the Tophet. These sacred precincts, found primarily at Carthage, Motya, and Sardinian colonies, contain thousands of urns holding cremated remains of infants and young animals. Carved stelae mark each deposit, inscribed with dedications to Tanit and Baal Hammon. Whether these represent child sacrifice, as Greek and Roman authors insist, or the sacred burial of children who died naturally, remains fiercely debated among scholars. The archaeological evidence reveals genuine complexity. Some urns contain only animal bones, suggesting substitution practices. Others hold the remains of prenatal or newborn infants whose cause of death cannot be determined from burned bone alone. Incense altars stand at household thresholds throughout every Phoenician city. Small limestone shrines occupy street corners. Religion is not confined to monumental temples, but woven into domestic routine, commercial practice, and civic governance. Priests hold political authority. Temple revenues fund public works. The sacred calendar dictates sailing seasons, market days, and diplomatic timing. Every ship carries protective amulets. Every warehouse threshold bears carved apotropaic symbols. Every craftsman's workshop contains a niche for divine offerings. The gods of the harbor do not merely bless the commerce that sustains these cities. They are inseparable from it, their temples rising on revenues drawn from purple dye and cedar timber, their worship carried westward on the same vessels that carry trade goods to every shore the Phoenicians touch. Those same vessels carry more than raw materials and sacred tokens. They carry the work of hands trained in techniques refined across centuries, objects so finely wrought that the courts of Assyria, Egypt, and the Aegean kingdoms compete to acquire them. Between 900 and 500 years before the Common Era, Phoenician artisans achieve a mastery of decorative craft that makes their workshops indispensable to the ancient world's most powerful rulers. Ivory arrives in Phoenician ports from African and Indian elephant herds, traded through Egyptian and Arabian intermediaries. In workshops clustered near the harbors of Sidon and Tyre, carvers transform raw tusks into panels of astonishing delicacy. Sphinxes with Egyptian headdresses recline beside Mesopotamian palmettes. Winged griffins borrowed from Aegean iconography guard sacred trees rendered in Assyrian style. A single ivory plaque, no larger than a human palm, might contain visual vocabulary drawn from 3 civilizations, synthesized into something entirely new. These panels adorn thrones, beds, and ceremonial furniture. Hundreds appear in the Assyrian palaces at Nimrud, stripped as tribute or commissioned directly, their craftsmanship so prized that conquerors who burn cities preserve the ivory workshops that serve them. Metalwork follows the same pattern of cultural fusion. Bronze bowls produced in Phoenician ateliers between the 9th and 7th centuries before the Common Era display. Concentric bands of narrative imagery, hammered and engraved with extraordinary precision. Egyptian processions circle the outer rim. Assyrian hunting scenes occupy the middle register. Greek geometric motifs frame the central medallion. These bowls travel as diplomatic gifts and luxury trade goods, appearing in Etruscan tombs, Greek sanctuaries at Olympia and Delphi, and Cypriot royal burials. Gold granulation techniques allow Phoenician jewelers to solder microscopic beads of gold onto pendants and earrings, creating surfaces that shimmer with texture invisible at arm's length, but breathtaking under close inspection. Crescent moon pendants, scarab rings, and filigree diadems emerge from these workshops, each piece demonstrating technical control that few contemporary cultures can match. Glass production, though not invented by the Phoenicians, reaches new sophistication in their coastal furnaces. Sand from the mouth of the Byblos River near Akko proves ideal for glass making. Core-formed vessels in deep blue, amber, and white emerge from kilns where temperatures are carefully controlled to produce translucent walls thin enough to reveal light passing through. Small perfume flasks and cosmetic containers become signature Phoenician exports, their vivid colors recognizable across the Mediterranean. What distinguishes Phoenician craft is not originality of motif, but brilliance of synthesis. These artisans absorb the visual languages of every civilization they encounter and recombine them into a cosmopolitan aesthetic that appeals to diverse markets simultaneously. An Assyrian king sees familiar imagery elevated by foreign technique. An Egyptian noble recognizes ancestral symbols rendered with unfamiliar elegance. A Greek aristocrat discovers Eastern luxury adapted to Western taste. This deliberate eclecticism is not artistic weakness, but commercial genius, a visual trade language as versatile as the alphabetic script emerging from the same culture. Workshops operate as family enterprises, skills passing from master to apprentice across generations. Specialized quarters within each city concentrate related trades, the heat of metalworking furnaces and the chemical stench of ivory softening solutions defining entire neighborhoods. Raw materials flow inward through the same commercial networks that carry finished goods outward, creating an integrated production system of remarkable efficiency. By the 6th century before the Common Era, Phoenician decorative arts begin absorbing Persian Achaemenid influences as new imperial masters reshape the political landscape. Yet the fundamental method endures. Phoenician hands continue translating the visual wealth of empires into portable, tradable, universally desirable objects, their workshops humming with the quiet industry that makes beauty itself a currency of power. Those workshops open onto streets barely wide enough for two men to pass shoulder to shoulder. The cities that produce such exquisite objects for distant courts are themselves dense, vertical, compressed places, their architecture shaped by the same geographic constraint that drives Phoenician ambition outward. The narrow coastal plain leaves precious little room for sprawl. Between 800 and 500 years before the Common Era, daily life in Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, and Berytus unfolds within a fabric of limestone and cedar so tightly woven that the smell of grilling fish mingles with the chemical bite of dye vats only a few doorways apart. Domestic structures rise 2 and sometimes 3 stories, their flat roofs serving as additional living space where families sleep during the suffocating summer months. Ground floors typically function as workshops or storage, with living quarters above, accessible by narrow internal staircases carved from local stone. Walls of rubble masonry receive coats of lime plaster. Floors of packed earth or simple flagstone bear the wear of generations. Cisterns cut into bedrock beneath each house collect rainwater, a necessity in cities where freshwater springs prove insufficient for growing populations. The architectural footprint remains modest. Most dwellings occupy no more than 50 square meters at ground level, yet the vertical stacking creates functional homes adapted to maritime urban density. Markets cluster near harbor gates, where arriving cargo transitions directly into commerce. Stalls display Cypriot copper ingots alongside Egyptian grain, Sardinian obsidian beside local ceramic oil lamps. Weights standardized to Phoenician measures ensure transactional consistency across the trading network. Merchants operate from permanent stone-fronted shops, their inventories reflecting the astonishing geographic reach of the commercial system they serve. Fish markets occupy separate quarters closer to the waterfront, where the daily catch of tuna, mullet, and bream arrives before dawn. The family unit anchors social organization. Extended households share adjoining properties, with patriarchal authority governing inheritance and commercial partnerships alike. Women manage domestic economies of considerable complexity, overseeing textile production within the home, preserving foods through salting and oil immersion, and maintaining the household religious shrines where small terracotta figurines of Astarte receive daily offerings of incense and grain. Marriage alliances between merchant families consolidate trade networks, binding commercial interest to kinship obligation. Diet reflects both coastal geography and trade access. Bread baked from wheat and barley forms the staple, supplemented by olives, figs, dates, lentils, and the omnipresent fish prepared fresh, salted, or fermented into a pungent sauce. Wine from local vineyards accompanies meals, stored in distinctive torpedo-shaped amphorae that archaeologists recover from sites spanning the entire Mediterranean. Death receives careful attention. Rock-cut chamber tombs outside city walls house multiple generations of the same family, their bodies placed in carved stone sarcophagi or simple pit graves depending on status. Burial goods, ceramic vessels, jewelry, amulets, razors, cosmetic implements accompany the deceased, reflecting beliefs about needs persisting beyond life. Terracotta masks with stylized features sometimes cover the faces of the dead, a practice particularly common in Western colonies. Cremation and inhumation coexist, varying by period and location without apparent doctrinal conflict. Priests maintain temple precincts that double as economic institutions, managing agricultural lands, collecting tithes, and administering sacred treasuries. Sailors consult temple oracles before voyages. Fishermen dedicate portions of exceptional catches. The rhythm of religious festivals punctuates the commercial calendar, binding spiritual obligation to the seasonal patterns of navigation and harvest that govern everything in these cities, where the quay serves as the true center of existence. That rhythm of sacred obligation and commercial routine shatters in 586 years before the Common Era, when the most powerful army on earth arrives at the gates of Tyre. Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon has already crushed Jerusalem, razed Solomon's temple to its foundations, and marched the Judean elite into captivity along the Euphrates. His campaigns across the Levant follow a methodical pattern of subjugation. One by one, the coastal cities calculate the cost of resistance. Sidon submits, its king accepting Babylonian suzerainty rather than risking annihilation. Byblos, diminished from its ancient grandeur, offers tribute without hesitation. The smaller harbors along the Phoenician littoral bend before the storm with practiced pragmatism. Tyre refuses. The calculation is not reckless. The city's rulers understand something that Nebuchadnezzar's generals must confront with mounting frustration. Old Tyre, the mainland settlement called Ushu, sprawls vulnerably along the shore, its warehouses and residential quarters exposed to siege engines and infantry assault. But the true city, the island fortress sitting roughly half a mile offshore, presents an entirely different proposition. Surrounded by deep water, fortified with walls rising directly from the sea, supplied by an internal spring and accessible only by ship, Island Tyre is a citadel that no land army can reach. Babylonian forces seize Ushu swiftly. The mainland quarter falls, its granaries emptied, its workshops stripped. Siege works rise along the coast, earthen ramparts, watchtowers, encampments stretching along the shoreline to prevent any communication between the island and the surrounding territory. Babylonian soldiers gaze across the strait at walls they cannot scale, at towers they cannot undermine, at a population that watches from parapets with grim determination. The siege becomes a war of exhaustion. Babylon possesses no significant naval capability. Unlike Assyria, which occasionally commandeered Phoenician vessels for maritime operations, Nebuchadnezzar commands an army built for continental warfare: infantry, cavalry, siege engineers trained to breach mud brick and stone fortifications on solid ground. The half-mile of Mediterranean water separating his forces from Tyre's island walls might as well be an ocean. Months stretch into years. The Babylonian army maintains its blockade, preventing overland trade from reaching the coast. Yet Tyre's ships continue to move. The island's harbors, one facing north and one facing south, remain operational. Vessels slip out under cover of darkness, maintaining supply lines to allied colonies and sympathetic ports. Grain arrives from Egypt. Timber comes from contacts further along the coast. The city endures not through abundance, but through the stubborn trickle of maritime commerce that no land-based siege can fully sever. The economic toll accumulates on both sides. Babylonian records hint at the staggering cost of maintaining an army in the field for years without decisive victory. Soldiers labor at siege works that yield nothing. The prophet Ezekiel, writing from Babylonian exile, delivers oracles against Tyre predicting its utter destruction, yet the prophecy remains unfulfilled in its most literal terms. The island holds. 13 years pass. 13 years of Babylonian encampment along the Tyrian shore, of diplomatic exchanges growing increasingly pragmatic, of a great empire discovering the limits of terrestrial power against a people who have made the sea their fortress. By 573 before the Common Era, a negotiated settlement emerges. Tyre accepts nominal Babylonian authority. Its king is likely replaced or confirmed under Babylonian oversight. Tribute arrangements are established. But the city is not sacked. Its walls are not breached. Its population is not marched into exile. The compromise reveals an essential truth about Phoenician survival. Tyre bends without breaking, preserving its commercial infrastructure, its fleet, its colonial connections. The mainland settlement of Ushu lies damaged, its role diminished. But the island city, battered, depleted, its treasury drained by years of constrained trade, remains sovereign in all but name. Its harbors still function, its ships still sail. The purple dye still stains the hands of workers who have endured more than a decade of siege with the same patient resilience their ancestors brought to every storm the Mediterranean has ever delivered. That patient resilience is soon tested by a new master, one who arrives not with siege engines, but with an offer. When Cyrus the Great topples Babylon in 539 years before the Common Era, the Phoenician cities face a choice that proves remarkably simple. The Achaemenid Persian Empire absorbs the former Babylonian provinces, and the coastal cities, exhausted by decades of Mesopotamian pressure, submit without resistance. What follows is not subjugation in the Assyrian mold, but something far more pragmatic, a partnership that will define Phoenician existence for nearly 2 centuries. The arrangement is elegant in its mutual benefit. Persia, a landlocked power ruling from Persepolis and Susa, possesses the largest empire the world has yet seen, but lacks a meaningful navy. Phoenicia possesses the finest fleet on the Mediterranean, but lacks the military strength to guarantee its own independence. The solution writes itself. Phoenician cities retain extraordinary autonomy, their own kings, their own laws, their own coinage, their own religious practices, in exchange for naval service and tribute. They are organized into a satrapy alongside Cyprus and parts of Syria, yet within that administrative framework they operate with a freedom that astonishes neighboring subject peoples. Sidon emerges as the primary beneficiary of this new order, eclipsing Tyre for the first time in centuries. The city's harbors expand. Its royal dynasty cultivates close ties with the great king. Persian architectural influences begin appearing alongside traditional Phoenician forms. Bull-headed column capitals, polished stone platforms, paradisos gardens enclosed within palace walls. The fusion is visible in the royal necropolis at Sidon, where sarcophagi blend Egyptian artistic traditions with emerging Greek naturalism, all commissioned by Phoenician kings governing under Persian authority. King Eshmunazar II of Sidon, ruling in the 5th century before the Common Era, leaves behind a black basalt sarcophagus inscribed in Phoenician script that reveals the rewards of Persian loyalty. The inscription records territorial grants from the great king himself, the fertile plains of Dor and Joppa along the Palestinian coast, given to Sidon in recognition of service. The Eshmun sanctuary above the city grows into a monumental complex, its terraces rising along the Bostrenos River valley, decorated with marble sculptures that demonstrate how deeply Greek aesthetic sensibilities have penetrated Phoenician sacred space. The true price of partnership becomes visible at Salamis. In 480 years before the Common Era, when Xerxes I launches his massive invasion of Greece, Phoenician warships form the backbone of the Persian fleet. 300 triremes from Sidon, Tyre, and Arwad cut through the Aegean, their cedar hulls and experienced crews representing the most formidable naval force in the Armada. Sidonian vessels carry the honor position at the fleet's right wing. The Phoenician contingent performs with distinction in earlier engagements, but the narrow straits at Salamis negate every advantage of open-water seamanship. Greek triremes, fighting in confined waters they know intimately, shatter the Persian fleet. Phoenician ships, crowded together and unable to maneuver, are rammed and burned in devastating numbers. The defeat stings, but does not sever the partnership. Phoenician cities rebuild their fleets. Persian gold continues flowing into coastal treasuries. Trade networks remain intact and even expand under the stability of Achaemenid administration. The great royal road system connecting Sardis to Susa facilitates overland commerce that complements maritime routes. Phoenician merchants operate freely across an empire stretching from Egypt to the Indus. Yet tensions simmer beneath the surface. In 351 years before the Common Era, Sidon revolts against Artaxerxes III. The rebellion ends catastrophically. The city burns, some accounts claim by the hands of its own citizens rather than surrender. 40,000 perish. The destruction reshapes the political landscape of the Phoenician coast, elevating Tyre once more as Sidon smoulders. Persian authority reasserts itself with a brutality that shatters the illusion of equal partnership and reveals the arrangement for what it has always been. Autonomy granted at the pleasure of an empire, revocable without appeal. The Phoenician cities rebuild again, as they always do, but the Achaemenid world that sheltered them is itself approaching its final years. The Achaemenid world does not simply fade, it shatters. In 334 years before the Common Era, a young Macedonian king crosses the Hellespont with 40,000 soldiers and a vision of universal empire. Alexander defeats the Persian forces at Granicus, then again at Issus in 333, where Darius III flees the battlefield. The Levantine coast lies open. City after city capitulates. Byblos submits. Sidon, still scarred from its failed revolt against Persia, welcomes the conqueror and installs a new king at his pleasure. The pattern seems clear. Phoenician pragmatism will simply exchange one imperial master for another. Tyre refuses. The island city sits half a mile offshore, encircled by walls rising 150 feet from the waterline. Its harbors face north and south, sheltering a fleet capable of contesting any naval approach. Fresh water arrives through submarine channels. Granaries hold reserves for prolonged isolation. The Tyrians offer Alexander peaceful terms and access to the mainland shrine of Melkart, but they will not open their gates or permit a foreign army on the island. The refusal is calculated. Tyre has endured 13 years of Babylonian blockade and survived. No army in recorded history has breached its sea walls. Alexander interprets the refusal as defiance that cannot stand. In January of 332 years before the Common Era, he orders the construction of a causeway, a mole of stone, timber, and rubble, stretching from the mainland directly toward the island. Engineers demolish the ruins of old mainland Tyre for building material. Cedar logs from the Lebanon mountains, the same forests that once enriched Phoenician kings, now serve a Macedonian siege. Workers drive wooden pilings into the seabed, packing the gaps with boulders hauled from quarries miles inland. The causeway grows steadily through the shallows near shore, where the water barely reaches a man's waist. Then the depth changes. As the mole approaches the island, the seafloor drops sharply. Tyrian warships harass the construction crews with arrows and incendiary projectiles. A fire ship packed with combustible materials destroys 2 siege towers erected at the causeway's advancing tip. Storms batter the unfinished structure. Alexander responds with relentless engineering. He widens the mole, constructs protective screens, and, critically, assembles a coalition fleet. Ships arrive from Sidon, Byblos, Cyprus, and Rhodes, eventually numbering over 200 vessels. The naval advantage that has protected Tyre for centuries evaporates in weeks as Allied warships blockade both harbours. The siege enters its final phase in July. Battering rams mounted on ships pound the southern wall. Tyrian defenders pour heated sand onto attackers, the grains slipping beneath armor and searing flesh. They deploy underwater obstacles and grappling chains against approaching vessels. The resistance is ferocious and inventive, but a breach opens in the southern fortifications. Macedonian assault troops pour through the gap, while simultaneous attacks strike both harbors. The city's interior becomes a killing ground. 8,000 Tyrians die in the fighting and its immediate aftermath. Alexander orders 2,000 survivors crucified along the shoreline, a spectacle of punishment visible for miles. 30,000 inhabitants, women, children, the elderly foreign residents, are sold into slavery. The Temple of Melkart alone provides sanctuary. Those who shelter within its walls are spared. The city that has traded with every civilization in the Mediterranean for over 2 millennia is gutted in a single afternoon. The causeway remains. Sediment accumulates against its flanks over the following centuries, widening the artificial connection until the island becomes a permanent peninsula. The geographic identity of Tyre, the unconquerable island, the fortress ringed by the sea, ceases to exist. What nature separated over millennia, 7 months of military engineering joins forever. Modern satellite imagery reveals the tombolo clearly, a teardrop of accumulated sand extending from the ancient mainland to what was once the proudest island in the Phoenician world. The siege does not merely defeat Tyre, it erases the physical reality upon which Tyrian power was built, transforming the map itself into a monument of conquest. But Tyre's daughter lives. Across the Mediterranean, on the North African coast, Carthage has spent 5 centuries growing from a refugee colony into the wealthiest city in the Western world. Its double harbour, one commercial, one military, shelters hundreds of warships and merchant vessels. Its agricultural hinterland, cultivated with sophisticated irrigation techniques learned from the Libyans and perfected by Punic agronomists, feeds a population approaching 700,000. The Topet sanctuaries still burn with offerings to Tanit and Baal-Hamon. The Phoenician language, now called Punic, fills the markets and council chambers. When Alexander's causeway buries the independence of the motherland, Carthage inherits the full weight of Phoenician civilization's ambitions. The collision with Rome begins over Sicily. In 264 years before the Common Era, both powers claim influence over Messana, and the First Punic War erupts across the island's sun-scorched plains and surrounding waters. Carthage commands the sea. Its quinqueremes, descendants of Phoenician naval architecture refined over generations, dominate the western Mediterranean. Rome possesses no meaningful fleet, yet Roman engineers capture a wrecked Carthaginian warship, reverse engineer its design, and construct over 100 vessels in 60 days. They add the Corvus, a boarding bridge with an iron spike that locks onto enemy decks, transforming naval combat into the infantry warfare Romans already master. At Mile in 260, Rome wins its first major sea battle. The war grinds on for 23 years, devastating Sicily's population and draining both treasuries. Carthage loses at the Aegates Islands in 241 and surrenders Sicily, its richest overseas territory. The humiliation festers. Carthage rebuilds its power in Iberia, exploiting the silver mines of the southeast coast. Hamilcar Barca, and then his son-in-law Hasdrubal, carve out a new empire from the peninsula's resources. Hamilcar's eldest son grows up in military camps among veterans and war elephants. In 218, Hannibal Barca marches from New Carthage with roughly 50,000 infantry, 9,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants. He crosses the Pyrenees, fords the Rhone, and then attempts what no military commander has contemplated, an autumn crossing of the Alps. The passage consumes 15 days. Rock slides, snowstorms, and hostile mountain tribes reduce his force by nearly half. Elephants slip on ice-covered ledges. Men freeze in mountain passes above the clouds. The army that descends into the Po Valley is battered, diminished, and terrifying. Hannibal proceeds to inflict upon Rome the worst military disasters in its history. At the Trebia in December of 218, he lures Roman legions into a prepared ambush. At Lake Trasimene the following spring, he conceals his entire army in morning fog and annihilates 15,000 Romans in 3 hours. Then comes Cannae. On the 2nd of August, 216, on the flat Apulian plain, Hannibal faces roughly 86,000 Roman soldiers with fewer than 50,000 of his own. His center deliberately yields, drawing the Roman mass forward into a crescent that slowly closes around them. Cavalry sweeps behind. The encirclement is complete. Between 50,000 and 70,000 Romans die in a single afternoon, the bloodiest day in ancient military history. Yet Hannibal never takes Rome. He lacks siege equipment, reinforcements arrive too slowly from Carthage, and Roman resilience proves inexhaustible. Publius Cornelius Scipio, later called Africanus, carries the war to North Africa itself. At Zama in 202, Scipio defeats Hannibal on Carthaginian soil, ending the Second Punic War. Carthage endures another half-century as a diminished but still prosperous trading state. Roman Senator Cato the Elder ends every speech with the same demand. In 149, Rome finds its pretext. The Third Punic War is less a war than a prolonged execution. Carthaginian citizens melt temple gold for weapons, women cut their hair for bowstring cordage. The siege lasts 3 years. In the spring of 146, Roman soldiers breach the walls and fight through the city street by street for 6 days. Fires consume the harbor district. The great library burns. The temples of Tanit collapse into ash. Scipio Aemilianus, grandson by adoption of Africanus, watches the flames and weeps, foreseeing the same fate awaiting Rome itself. The surviving population, perhaps 50,000, is sold into slavery. The city is systematically demolished. The site is cursed. The Phoenician civilization's greatest daughter ceases to exist, though its alphabet, its trade routes, and its memory endure in every letter written thereafter. The ashes of Carthage settle across the Mediterranean like a final exhale, but along the Levantine coast, the cities that gave birth to that doomed colony continue to breathe, though each breath draws in a little more of someone else's air. The Phoenician homeland has already spent 2 centuries under Hellenistic rule, first the Ptolemies claiming the southern ports, then the Seleucids absorbing the entire coastline. Greek becomes the language of administration, of philosophy, of ambition. The old Phoenician script does not vanish overnight. It retreats into temple inscriptions, into private correspondence, into the stubborn memory of priests who still invoke Melkart and Astarte by their ancient names. Sidon reinvents itself with remarkable fluidity. Its artisans produce sarcophagi carved in pure Greek style, marble figures reclining in poses borrowed from Athenian funerary art, yet the names inscribed upon them remain Phoenician. This duality defines the twilight centuries. Identity becomes layered rather than singular, each generation adding another coat of Hellenistic varnish over Canaanite wood. When Rome absorbs the Seleucid territories after 64 years before the Common Era, Pompey reorganizes the coast into the province of Syria. Phoenician cities receive varying degrees of autonomy. Tyre and Sidon retain nominal freedom as allied communities, their ancient prestige earning them a courtesy that carries little real sovereignty. Byblos, the oldest of them all, becomes a quiet provincial town, its great temple of Balat Gebal slowly merging with the cult of Roman Venus. Berytus undergoes the most dramatic transformation. In 15 years before the Common Era, Augustus refounds it as Colonia Julia Augusta Felix Berytus, settling 2 Roman legions veterans on its soil. Roman engineers lay a grid of colonnaded streets directly over Phoenician foundations. A massive forum rises where merchant warehouses once stood. Bathhouses, a hippodrome, and temples to Jupiter replace the intimate sacred precincts of Eshmun. The city becomes so thoroughly Roman that by the 2nd century of the Common Era it houses one of the empire's 3 great law schools, training jurists whose commentaries will shape the Justinian Code centuries later. Phoenician Berytus vanishes beneath Roman Beirut as completely as Tyre's island vanished beneath Alexander's causeway. Along the coast, the material evidence of absorption accumulates in archaeological layers. Roman colonnades stand on Phoenician ashlar blocks. Latin dedicatory inscriptions appear beside fading Phoenician graffiti on harbour walls. The purple dye industry continues. Rome's appetite for the colour is insatiable, and imperial legislation eventually restricts its use to the emperor alone. But the workshops now operate under Roman commercial law, their profits taxed by distant administrators. In North Africa, the Punic language proves surprisingly resilient. Farmers in the Tunisian hinterland still speak a form of it well into the 4th century of the Common Era. St. Augustine notes that his rural congregants near Hippo use Punic words in daily speech. But this is survival at the margins, a linguistic ember glowing in countryside villages while the cities blaze with Latin and Greek. The gods endure longest. Melkart merges with Heracles, Astarte with Aphrodite, Eshmun with Asclepius. These are not simple replacements, but genuine syntheses, the old rituals persisting beneath new names. At the great sanctuary of Eshmun near Sidon, worshippers continue to seek healing well into the Roman period, leaving votive offerings that blend Phoenician iconography with Greco-Roman forms. Baby figurines wrapped in swaddling sit beside marble statuettes of classical gods. The sacred spring still flows, yet something essential dissolves. No one calls themselves Phoenician anymore. The word itself was always Greek, an outsider's label. But even the internal sense of distinct Canaanite identity fades into the broader category of Syrian provincial. Intermarriage, education in Greek rhetoric, careers in Roman administration, these forces accomplish what Assyrian armies and Babylonian sieges never could. The Phoenician people do not die. They become invisible, absorbed into the vast human fabric of the Roman Mediterranean, their bloodlines continuing in families who no longer remember the purple-stained harbors, the cedar-scented shipyards, the 22 letters that changed everything. But the invisible does not mean the vanished. Centuries pass. The Roman Empire fractures, Christianity reshapes the Levant, Arab conquest brings new languages and new faiths, Crusaders raise fortresses on ancient harbors, Ottoman administration layers itself over millennia of ruin. Beneath it all, the Phoenician inheritance persists in forms so fundamental they have become unrecognizable as Phoenician at all. Every letter on this screen descends from those 22 signs first scratched into limestone at Byblos. The aleph, a stylized ox head, rotates and simplifies through Greek hands into alpha, then through Latin into the letter that begins the English alphabet. The beth, a house, becomes beta, then the curved form known today. The gimel, a camel or throwing stick, transforms into gamma, then into the third letter of the Roman sequence. Each of the 22 original signs follows a similar journey, crossing the Aegean around the 9th century before the Common Era, acquiring vowels the Phoenicians never wrote, then traveling westward to Rome, northward to the Slavic world through Cyrillic adaptation, and eventually across oceans to every continent. Arabic and Hebrew scripts trace parallel lineages back to the same Canaanite root. More than half of humanity today writes in systems born from that narrow coastal strip. The archaeological rediscovery begins slowly. In 1860, the French scholar Ernest Renan leads an expedition to Phoenicia, excavating at Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre. The sarcophagus of King Eshmunazar, already recovered in 1855, yields a lengthy Phoenician inscription that helps scholars reconstruct the language. In 1923, the discovery of the Ahiram sarcophagus at Byblos reveals one of the oldest known alphabetic inscriptions, anchoring the entire history of Western writing to a single carved limestone coffin in a Lebanese hillside tomb. Modern Beirut sprawls over ancient Berytus. Construction crews digging foundations for new buildings periodically strike Phoenician walls, Roman baths, Ottoman cisterns layered in vertical chronology. The National Museum of Beirut holds Phoenician gold jewelry, glass vessels that still catch light after 3,000 years, and bronze figurines of gods whose names echo in place names across the Mediterranean. Cadiz remembers Gadir. Malta preserves Punic inscriptions. Sardinia holds Tophet remains. Sicily's western coast still carries the imprint of Motia's causeways. On Mount Lebanon, small groves of cedars survive. The trees that once covered these slopes in dense forests, that built Egyptian solar barks and Solomon's temple, and the birems that crossed to Carthage, now number only a few hundred ancient specimens in protected reserves. The cedar appears on the Lebanese flag, a national symbol connecting a modern republic to its deepest antiquity. The tree endures as the Phoenicians themselves endure, not as a living political entity, but as a root system beneath the surface of Mediterranean civilization. Navigation principles first developed by Tyrian and Sidonian sailors, the use of stellar observation for open water crossings, the establishment of way stations at regular intervals, the concept of maritime insurance through shared risk among merchants, these practices pass through Greek and Roman hands into medieval Italian maritime law and onward into the foundations of modern global commerce. The very idea that the sea connects rather than divides, that water is a highway and not a barrier, is a Phoenician conviction that reshaped human geography. Their story carries no triumphant final act. There is no last emperor, no dramatic fall. Instead, there is something rarer and more profound, a civilization that dissolved into the bloodstream of the world, whose greatest invention sits so close to human consciousness that it feels like nature rather than invention. Every word written, every contract signed, every poem composed in alphabetic script is an unconscious act of Phoenician remembrance. The purple has faded from the harbors, the cedar forests have thinned to sacred groves, but the letters remain, alive in every hand that writes, every eye that reads, carrying forward across millennia the quiet genius of a people who turned shells into splendor and scratches into immortality. Thank you for joining this journey through the complete story of Phoenicia. If these waters have carried something of value, consider subscribing so that future voyages into the ancient world reach your shore as well.